Alright, we're going to start out now with our first lecture on the respiratory system. And some of the things we're going to look at in this chapter are not only the why gases are exchanged, but also how gases are exchanged. So we want to see kind of what's involved with allowing gases to get to where they need to be, whether it's O2 or CO2 or nitric oxide or whatever. We're going to take a look at those different gases. We are going to take a look at different types of evolutionary adaptations for gas exchange. So those would be things like gills versus trachea in insects, whether it's parabronchi in birds or even mammals having lungs. We'll take a look at different types of evolutionary adaptations. And then finally, to kind of wrap up this chapter, we're going to take a look at the human respiratory system, kind of the parts involved, how they operate, how the breathing cycle works, respiratory cycle, how that works, and so on. So one of the things, the main thing we need to look at in this chapter is why we need to have a respiratory system in the first place. And so primarily what we are dealing with here are oxygen and CO2, right? So we need to have oxygen inside of our cells to fuel aerobic cellular respiration to produce ATP to fuel our cells. And also in the process of doing that, there is the production of CO2, which needs to be disposed of by the body. In the case of all vertebrates, and really this is the case for not only vertebrates, but for most animals in general, in order to have gas exchange, in order to have diffusion of gases, there has to be a bit of a damp covering of the respiratory system, whether it's gills, whether it's trachea, whether it's lungs or parabronchi or what have you. The respiratory tract always has to be lined with some type of aqueous environment or substance to help gas exchange occur more smoothly. In all cases, the gas exchange that's done inside the body, whether it's humans or otherwise, is passive diffusion. So we are talking about moving from high concentration to low concentration. We're not doing any active transport. We're not doing any facilitated diffusion. We're doing passive diffusion right across the plasma membranes of the cells, like red blood cells, for example. And specifically in terms of concentration, we're dealing with solubilities. We're dealing with partial pressures of gases as well in the solutions to determine which direction those gases are going to go. So the person in this picture is, it's a bit of a side note, his name is Alfred Russel Wallace. He was kind of the co-discoverer of evolution, and he thought a lot about gas exchange and the kinds of things that might affect how gases are exchanged across a surface and how quickly they be exchanged across the surface as well. So he was dealing with respiration rate. And so there is a chemical relationship that exists here that says that the rate of diffusion, R is rate of diffusion, right? And so in general, in most animals, at least for gases, oxygen and CO2 in particular, you always want the R value to be as high as possible. You want the rate of diffusion to be as big as possible, as much as possible. And so to do that, there are some things that can be at play here. There is a surface area increase. The big A in this equation stands for surface area. So if you increase the size of the surface area of the respiratory tract, that should allow for more gases to be exchanged, which kind of makes sense, right? The more space you have, the quicker you can do this process. We can look at the distance across which the gas has to travel. So if you have a really short distance, then diffusion should happen faster. If the gas has to go a much longer distance, then diffusion might take a little bit longer. So minimizing the denominator in this case, minimizing the little d, is going to help the overall R value, which is rate of diffusion, be as big as possible. We could also look at delta P. Delta P is the difference in pressures of the gases from one side of the membrane to the other side of the membrane. So there are even some physiological adaptations to help maximize the delta P value to ensure that there is as little as CO2 on one side of the membrane as possible and as much CO2 as possible on the other side of the membrane. And that's going to also help diffusion happen quicker. Incidentally, the big D in this equation is a diffusion constant, and that differs for the different gases, but as far as living things are concerned, we really can't do a whole lot to mess around with the big D value. That's a set number, a physical constant number that differs depending on which of the gases you're looking at. So that one's going to be the same for oxygen. No matter what kind of animal, no matter what you're trying to do, the diffusion constant will be the same. But surface area can change evolutionarily. Partial pressure differences across the membrane could change. Distance could change as well. So all of those things will affect rate of diffusion. And different kinds of animals have found ways to maximize rate of diffusion using those three terms. All right, so now we're going to start looking at some adaptations of different organisms in order to do gas exchange. Some things that all animals in common. Doesn't matter who you are. You could be a roundworm, could be a flatworm, could be a fish, could be a snail. They all have kind of the same features, some of the same features when it comes to gas exchange. Number one, I've already mentioned the respiratory surface must be moist so that gases can diffuse across the membrane. If the respiratory surface dries out, diffusion stops. And it's just that simple. If the respiratory surface dries out, there will not be any more diffusion of gases. The second one is that the cells that line the respiratory system have to be thin so that gas exchange is maximized. And so if we think back to our equation here, that will be little d. We want to have this number as small as possible. We want the surface across which gases travel has to be especially thin. And so that's also a constant. We want there to be a relatively thin layer separating the two parts we want the gases to go so that that little d value is minimized and therefore rate of diffusion is maximized. And then finally, the respiratory surface also has to be large, which is why we find the intricacy when it comes to the gills of a fish, the parabronchi of a bird, the alveoli of a mammal. Extensive surface area. And again, if we go back to our equation here, increasing A right here is going to help us maximize rate of diffusion. So anything you do to increase the numerator will increase rate of diffusion. Anything you could do to decrease the denominator will also increase rate of diffusion. So it's a good relationship to know. So the overall pattern we're looking at here is we have to find some way to get air into the lungs. We have to then do, this is part of what's called external respiration. So this is where we're getting air into the lungs. We're getting oxygen into or onto the red blood vessels in the lungs, where it can be transported through the circulatory system to the tissues, where internal respiration is going on, right? So we've got that going on over here as well, where we have an exchange of oxygen and CO2 between the body and the blood cells. So that's kind of the overall function here. We've got breathing, external respiration, which is the actual gas exchange that occurs in the lungs. We also have gas transport via the circulatory system, and then finally we have internal respiration at the tissues. So on land, we're not going to spend a ton of time looking at fish gills, but one of the things that shows up in the water for animals that have gills, those gills tend to be very, very efficient. In fact, a fish's gills are more efficient than your lungs are, and they kind of have to be because there simply isn't as much oxygen in the water as what there is on land. Your lungs can afford to be less efficient because there's plenty of oxygen around and it's not really all that hard to find any. So one thing you might ask yourself, okay, well, if gills are so efficient, why not just keep gills on land? Why did the things that moved onto land from the water develop all of a sudden lungs if gills are so efficient? Okay, so there's a couple of things here. Number one is that air is not very supportive. Water is. So in the water, for example, your body is almost weightless, whereas on land it has a certain weight to it, which you can step onto a scale and detect whatever that weight might be. In the water is a fluid supportive medium, so it takes a lot of the pressure off not only your body, but also your respiratory surface. The respiratory surface itself gets support being surrounded by water, so it doesn't have to have a lot of structure to it. On land, however, gills, because they don't have structural support, tend to collapse on themselves, and you start to lose that A term. The surface area term starts to get smaller. In a sense, the D term gets bigger because the lungs are collapsing on themselves, the gills are collapsing on themselves, and affecting those terms accordingly. The other aspect about gills is that they tend to dry out very easily. So if you take a fish from the water and put it on land, within a span of a few seconds, or maybe at most a few minutes, the gills are going to dry out, and as we've seen before, gas exchange is going to stop after the respiratory surfaces dry out. So the lung actually helps prevent some of these problems. Number one, it's got a bit more structural integrity to it. Number two, it's got a lot more support around it. And when you're breathing in air, you're also conditioning that air before it gets to the part of the lungs where the exchange actually occurs. So we have a conditioning part of the respiratory tract to help humidify the air and minimize any loss of water that might otherwise occur. So a lot of pre-treating the air before it actually gets into the lungs. Now, in the case of reptiles, in the case of amphibians, in the case of mammals, there is a two-way flow system where you're either inhaling or exhaling at any given moment in time. Birds, on the other hand, have a one-way flow system, which, as it turns out, on land is more efficient, but we simply haven't seen that many animals evolve that type of respiratory tract. Only birds have that one. So again, the pathway of movement of gases, red being oxygen-rich, blue being oxygen-poor, is going to go from the nose or mouth, the pharynx, to the trachea, to the bronchus, big passages in the conducting part of the respiratory tract, to bronchioles, which are smaller passages, and then eventually down to the alveoli and into the capillaries of the circulatory system from there. That's for oxygen. Now for CO2 coming out, it's the opposite direction. We have blood capillaries dumping out CO2 into the alveoli. From there, the CO2 is going to the bronchioles and bronchi, which by the way is plural for bronchus. Bronchi is plural for bronchus, and eventually to trachea and then the pharynx from there. Our lungs as mammals are especially complex. We see literally anywhere between 2 and 300 million what are called alveoli per lung. These are very, very tiny air sacs. In this picture, you can see them pretty well. Very small, almost like clusters of grapes, completely surrounded by circulatory tissue, lots and lots of capillaries around those air sacs, and that's going to help maximize the surface area for diffusion. The pathway of airflow, again, would be to go from the larynx, which is kind of the equivalent of the voice box, through the glottis, which is the opening to the trachea itself, into the bronchi. So there's a bifurcation or a split or a fork in the road into the right and left bronchus. From there into bronchioles, and from the bronchioles eventually to the alveoli and the surrounding capillaries to get that oxygen into the blood or get the CO2 out of the blood. So that's kind of how our respiratory system is set up. Not every animal works this way. Certainly there are plenty that don't, but for a typical mammal, especially human, that's a pretty good representation of what the movement of airflow is going to look like. We can also look at it in terms of pressures. So if we look, for example, at the partial pressure of, down here, partial pressure of oxygen versus partial pressure of CO2 in the veins, going back to the heart, the overall pressure of oxygen is relatively low, the overall pressure of CO2 is relatively high, so we want to move that blood into the right atrium, to the right ventricle, out to the lungs, and then all of a sudden, once we get to the lungs, we're going to lose like 6 millimeters of mercury worth of pressure for CO2, and we're going to gain like 65 millimeters of mercury worth of pressure for oxygen. So we're going to see a big, big drop in CO2 and a huge drop in oxygen, and by that time, the blood moving back to the left atrium and eventually left ventricle is oxygen rich. Now we're at 105 millimeters of mercury for O2 and 40 millimeters of mercury for CO2. And then again, as we move out to the rest of the body, as we go from the lungs to the heart, or the heart to the brain, or the heart to the rest of the body, we see these changes in partial pressure of gases as we go through the different parts of the circulatory system. So from there, we're going to go into the human respiratory system. We're looking at respiratory system, not circulatory system. That's what I get for recording these on the same day, getting the names mixed up. This is respiratory system. And we'll see how our respiratory system works. So again, like I mentioned, there are two main parts to our respiratory system. There is the conducting part, which is getting air in, so everything from the nose and mouth to the pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and bronchioles, those are all the conducting parts of the respiratory tract. There is no exchange that occurs across the respiratory tract. This is kind of the equivalent to what arteries and arterioles were for the circulatory system. Now we have a non-exchanging part, just a conducting part of the respiratory system. And then we have the exchange part as well. But before we get to those, we also want to talk about what else goes on in the conducting part of the respiratory tract. We've got the conditioning going on, the warming of air and humidifying of air. If you've ever been out running on a cold day when it's really dry, it's painful on your lungs because you're perhaps breathing hard, you're breathing through your mouth. The cold air is hitting your lungs a lot sooner than what it would otherwise if you're breathing through your nose. And so it tends to be a little bit hard on your lungs. You may find yourself coughing during or after the run because of that cold air. The other aspect that takes place in the conducting part of the respiratory tract is filtration. So back in our chapter on animal tissues and homeostasis, we saw goblet cells producing mucus. We saw ciliated cells moving the mucus up and out. This is the filter part of the respiratory tract to help make sure that nothing really bad gets down into the alveoli, or at least as much as possible. We want to prevent that. So we've seen goblet cells. We've also seen ciliated cells to help get some of this gunk up and out when we experience it. So again, the nasal oral cavity, pharynx, larynx, epiglottis, trachea, and bronchi, and I would even throw in bronchioles as well because they are certainly part of the conducting aspect of the respiratory system. Now the nose itself, we're going to start off and go kind of section by section and look at some of the points of interest along the way in the respiratory system. We have a nasal septum, so that would be the divider between the two nasal cavities. And again, we have a mucous membrane that covers the inner surfaces of the nose to help prevent the arrival or at least the establishment of any sort of bacteria, viruses, those kinds of things. It's a pretty good first filter of breathing air in through the nose. So we're going to clean the air. We're also going to warm and moisten the air. It turns out the air going into the nose onto the trachea, for example, has to pass through a bunch of different respiratory passages just in the nose. So by the time that air gets into the trachea especially, It's already been warmed up, it's already been humidified, it's not going to dry us out, it's going to be as close to ambient air inside the body as what you could ever hope to find. We also have sense of smell going on there as well. So we have chemoreceptors, right? We have the ability to smell substances as well in the nose. So it's a fairly diverse organ. We've got cleaning of air, we've got moistening and warming of air, we've got filtration, we've also got sense of smell going on there with the nose. The sinuses, which you may have heard of or maybe only think of when you have a sinus infection or sinusitis, are the sort of air sacs you find in and around the air spaces or the faces in your, the bones in your face. So the air cavities we find around these facial bones are called the sinuses. They're connected to the nasal cavities. They're going to help make the head less dense overall. So instead of your head just being one solid mass of bone, these air spaces tend to make it a bit lighter. Again, we've got the conditioning of air. We have a resonating chamber that affects your voice. So you know when your nose is stuffy, when your sinuses are inflamed, or if you're sick in some way, your voice changes. Right? You get more nasal or something like that because nasal sounding because you've got this inflammation of sinuses in the face, and that's going to affect how your voice sounds. We also have, like I mentioned, sinusitis, where you've got some sort of inflammation or infection of the sinus cavities, which can be a real problem for some folks. Some folks seem to get sinus infections, even 2 or 3 of them a year in some cases. So they're fairly common, and not a whole lot of fun to have if you've ever had one. Not the end of the world. They're not going to kill you necessarily, but they're also not the most pleasant thing to experience. The pharynx is kind of generally defined as the space behind the nose and the mouth. So the area kind of at the back part of your mouth is the pharynx. This is kind of a common passageway for food, for drink, for air that you're breathing in. They all kind of go through the pharynx or pharyngeal area. There's also a connection to the middle ear through the eustachian tubes. So we have a bit of sense of sound, auditory sound going on here. We also have equalization of pressure. So if you've ever been on an airplane or in the other direction, if you've ever gone scuba diving, you've probably experienced the change in pressure, which causes your ears to want to pop. Otherwise, it can be extremely painful, excruciating if you try to swim down to a really deep depth while holding your breath. It can be very, very painful because the pressure doesn't equalize unless you sort of make it happen on your own. Otherwise, it's very difficult to swim to that depth because of the pain associated with the pressure in the eustachian tubes. All right, the last one that we're going to look at now in this section of lecture is the larynx. And the larynx is also called the voice box or the Adam's apple. This is the top part of the trachea. So if we look at this picture over here, we've got the epiglottis, which is a flap of tissue that covers over the glottis. The glottis is right there. And then we have the larynx. So the broader part of the top part of the trachea is the larynx. And these lines here represent the vocal cords, which as air passes over them, helps to create sound, right? So we see vocal cords, if we can get this to cooperate here and also here. It's more of a box-like structure, mostly cartilaginous, as is much of the trachea. There's plenty of cartilage located in the trachea to help give it support and structure. This is, in a couple of ways, a very important part of the respiratory tract. This is how we get down deeper into the respiratory tract is through the larynx. It's also how we talk, right? So voice and sound are associated with the larynx as well. So a fairly important one. And again, if you've ever had laryngitis, where the vocal cords or the larynx is inflamed or swollen, it can be fairly debilitating, especially if you talk for a living like I do. Coming to class and trying to lecture with severe laryngitis is always a challenge, and often challenging for students to even be able to hear you, and that's when that's the case. All right, so the larynx is involved with swallowing. The swallowing reflex, we'll see more of it in the digestive system, but what happens here is that the larynx essentially pushes up and back. And the little flap of tissue I showed you in the last slide, this epiglottis back here, when the larynx is elevated up, the top part of the trachea, which is also called the glottis, is going to be pushed against the epiglottis. And so what that means is that you have a way to prevent things like food and water from going down into the trachea toward the lungs, where it can cause a lot of gasping and coughing and stuttering and so on, because you've swallowed something, quote unquote, down the wrong pipe, which in this case is a fairly accurate representation of what's going on here, right? So the epiglottis is sort of a covering over the glottis to allow you to still eat or drink and get things down your esophagus without those same things going down into your trachea. So it's a fairly handy kind of a thing to have. If you do swallow something down the wrong pipe, coughing very frequently will get it out to where it needs to go. But there actually are cases where if something is lodged in the larynx, or in the trachea, anything short of the Heimlich maneuver could result in that person choking to death. It's not an uncommon sort of a thing where somebody partially swallows something, it gets lodged partway back, and so you've got this obstruction to airflow, which could lead to suffocation unless you have someone that happens to be knowledgeable in the Heimlich maneuver. So the vocal cords themselves are strands of tissue. It should be strands of tissue, not stands of tissue, that are stretched over the glottis. Again, the glottis is the opening to the trachea. When those vocal cords vibrate back and forth, that's going to be the source of your voice. And so the tighter you stretch those vocal cords, the higher your voice goes. The more relaxed they are, the lower your voice goes. And so we can also affect the pitch of our voice by, even consciously, affecting the tightness of those vocal cords. And laryngitis, like I mentioned, is where you have inflammation of the larynx, which is usually not a whole lot of fun, because even if you try to force yourself to do so, you can't talk because everything is so swollen in there that there's just simply no sound being produced. So initially starts off as a deepening of voice, which is kind of cool at first if it's not too painful, but then the voice kind of goes together altogether, and it's very difficult to talk with any sound at all, really. All right, so we're going to stop here, and we'll pick up with the trachea in the next section. So we'll just close this down here.